This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Stopping at one or two children is such a norm in Singapore that a large family now means having 3 or more children. This official definition comes after the government launched the Large Families Scheme in 2025 in a bid to encourage Singaporeans to have at least 3 children. In its first year alone, the scheme has already stepped in to help about 5,000 Singaporean children. Each of them received up to $16,000 in additional grants to ease the financial load of multi-child parenting. But can money alone shift a couple's mindsets to having more children? Hello, I'm Lynda Hong, Assistant Podcast Editor of the Straits Times. You're listening to In Your Opinion. Joining me today to unpack the anxieties, the realities, and the future of raising kids in Singapore is an academic who spent years conducting research into the lived experiences of Singaporean households, tracking everything from the evolving pressures of intensive parenting to how dual-income couples navigate career and family size. Dr. Kalpana Vignehsa, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lynda. Thanks for having me.
So, Kalpana, why are Singaporeans not having enough kids or deciding not having kids altogether?
For a long time, the falling birth rates were always seen as something like, married couples or coupled people are choosing to have fewer children. But we also see across the world more and more people choosing to remain single. And that's not even talking about getting married, just not wanting to be in a relationship at all. So these are like larger trends that are just happening all over the world. And we in Singapore participate in those trends as well. And that's what we're seeing. Yes, we live in a place that's expensive. Every child involves resources that a parent puts forth. Even what is put forth for each child has changed over time. For example, the period of time a child spends in education is much longer today than what they used to spend in education, say 20, 30 years ago. So your kind of baseline idea for what is needed has grown. And that's just sort of like what people see as the basic or normal. Like we have a very highly educated society. But there's also intensive parenting norms that have taken hold that are much more pronounced today than they were in the past. So the amount of energy and time you put into each individual child is greater. And so one might say that it makes sense that people think, that's a lot. That's the other outlay, whether it's in effort, time, money, it's all greater. And so it's very easy to slide into seeing the whole thing, the whole enterprise of having children as this burdensome activity.
And so does that come across in the surveys that you've conducted? Burdensome, need to have more resources for the children, more education, more expensive, is that the feedback that households and family have given you in the surveys that you have conducted?
I think that we often kind of, in a way, misinterpret what is going on a little bit because you cannot take away from the fact that children cost money in the sense they cost money to raise. But often when you're talking to parents, they have children they want to raise in the sense that they are committed to doing so. And parents themselves rarely articulate that their children are burdens. They love having their children. They want to care for them. So it's not so much that the children are burdensome, but they find the whole kind of like the network that they are plugged into, the society that they are raising their children in, what it means to be a parent. These can be interpreted as burdens because often people will say, time, I don't have enough time. I had children because I want to spend time with them. It's not an afterthought. It was not because I was just following a script. People are a lot more intentional about becoming parents today than they were in the past for a whole bunch of reasons. So if you have children, so talking to parents is a very different picture from talking to non-parents in terms of how they think about the possibility of having a child. There you hear a lot more about the idea that it's a burden, right? So when people are considering whether to have a child or not, they talk a lot more about how it's going to affect their lifestyle. Do they really want to have children? Are they emotionally and psychologically ready to have children? Am I going to pass on my baggage to my children? Those conversations are hardly ever the conversations that people who are already parents are having. People who are already parents are people who have already made that jump. And for them, it's more like, is this the life that I want to have with my children? Depending on how materially focused you are, some parents are thinking about, I have to put aside X amount of money for each of my children. How do I balance that with wanting to do other things with them that are not financial? So I think for parents, it's how do I juggle the need to provide and the need to provide a certain quality of life with being a good parent in my book, according to their standards. That's a conversation that you hear from parents. That's the struggle that you hear from parents. Yes, you hear about the sleepless nights. You hear about how stretched they feel. Being a parent is this activity that, you're kind of, once you take the plunge, you have a child, you're kind of biologically wired to care for that child in a very intense way. Parents will complain, but in most cases, they'll still pull through and do what they feel is right. So yeah, I think what you hear on the ground is this very sort of if you talk to parents, you hear about their struggles, but it's not a case of like, oh, I wish my children were not here. It's not that they want to go back to a child-free life. And they are making all of those decisions within a structural ecosystem that we have in Singapore. That's what parents talk about. I have no choice. The PSLE is coming. I'm going to have to take if my child's not doing well enough, according to me, I need to do something to help them out. That's the box that they have to live in, right? So those are the things that dominate their thoughts. Yeah.
Let's talk about the number of children then. In one of your commentaries on the Straits Times, you have actually mentioned that might be more effective to concentrate efforts to encourage one-child families to have another kid rather than to put efforts into encouraging people to have large families. Could you elaborate on that?
Insofar as we are using the large family scheme as a means to boost fertility, right? Then you got to look at the numbers, and about 42% had 2 children, but only 18% had 3 or more children. And the 3+ share had fallen by more than 7% in the 5 years prior. So you can see that the large family scheme is targeting a group that's shrinking quite rapidly already. And then alongside that, we also did a poll. I did a poll with a colleague in 2024 that found that 54.2% of parents with one child said that they'd like another child. But that drops to 22.1% amongst those with 2 children. So that's a big drop, right? More than half of the parents with one child, they feel positive towards the idea of having another child. It's less than a quarter who, with 2 children who want another child. So in my mind, you can build on that momentum, because that momentum, demographically speaking, is very hard to build completely from the ground up. You can't create it out of thin air, But when people already have that desire, it's much easier to work with. And the switch from 1 to 2 is qualitatively very different from the switch to 2 to 3 for a bunch of reasons. It can, in some ways, actually, the switch from 1 to 2 is a big deal. It's not that it's not a big deal. I mean, I experienced it myself, and it was a big deal. But mentally, you can still kind of think, both parents are going to keep their jobs. They are going to continue working full-time. They can still manage 2 children. In the interviews I do, it's very rare that a family with 3 or more children have double income family. And so the decision making has a kind of compounding effect on the family. Like, what does it mean to become a single income family? Who is the person that's going to provide the single income? Is it going to be shared by 2 parents? Is it going to be just one parent that continues to be employed whilst the other person is at home with the children? Or alternatively, do we need to hire a helper? Because you need additional help with 3 children. And is my HDB flat actually large enough to have a 3rd child and a helper? Do I want to have a helper in my house because that also changes the dynamics of home, let alone a physically small home. So there are all these additional things going on, whereas I still interview a fair few families with 2 kids where they are somehow making it work, with both the parents working and the children being in, childcare and maybe a few other additional supports with grandparents and things. So if you add a 3rd child into the mix, it just means you have to think, how am I going to manage this logistically? I have spoken to many parents who say, 2 weeks ago, one of the kids came down with HFMD and then the school said all 3 can't attend. So now how do I take care of, 3 sick kids and there's not enough days of childcare leave and things like that. There are all these things that just keep coming up until the kids are of a certain age and a little bit more independent. So I think that going back to the purpose of the policy, right? I think policy can have multiple purposes. And the way in which I agree with the large family label is that it is true that in our context in 2026, having 3 or more children makes you you do have a large family relative to the other family sizes around. So in that sense, and let's bear in mind that we didn't consider families with 3 kids to be large families until quite recently. So in that sense, I think, yes, we should go for it. We should celebrate the fact that there are people who are having 3 or more children, and we should find ways to make it easier for them to, have those large families. And I don't mean just in piecemeal sort of way, like, free museum tickets or whatever. I mean, like, can we be more creative in terms of, yes, when you have 3 kids, does having a car become far more important than when you have 2 kids? Can we think about helping families with the cost of the COE? We can think about those kinds of policies. So that is something or having a larger flat. Like, there are all these things that we should put on the table, like proper public policies that could help large families. But in terms of kind of having overarching financial incentives for families having that next child, I feel like, to me, the data is quite clear. There's a much larger group of people who feel positive about it, and for good reason. They have had one. I always say, it's never talked about this way, but having children is a sequential decision. You never have 3 kids because you want 3 kids. You have 3 kids because first one went well enough to have the second one went well enough to have the 3rd one, right? So you need to be talking to those people who are, maybe I'll have a 2nd child, right? And we know that there's so many more couples in Singapore who are like, oh, no, I'll just stop at 1. But they are far more persuadable than people who already have 2 kids because they have grown up in a culture that has emphasized having 2 children. So for many people, whether we like it or not, this kind of ideal family norm, it starts almost with 2 kids in your mind. It may not happen, but it's like that's the environment that the people making decisions, the parents making decisions today, they grew up in that environment. So from a policy perspective, you can capitalize on that cultural kind of ethos that already exists and build on that. And that doesn't mean that people having a 3rd child should miss out. They also can, I'm just saying that I think that it should be extended to all the people with one child to consider, because they've already made the leap into being parents. They've already had that big shift. That's the biggest shift.
I'm also just curious, is there a possibility among the parents that you've spoken with to increase the age difference in between children so that it's easier? Because from what I hear, when you say that HFMD, it's for toddlers, for kindergarten children, unlikely for primary school children, I assume. So is there a possibility when parents want to increase the age difference so that it's easier for them to manage?
The truth of the matter is that the most intense part of parenting is in the early years. And let's say the first 8 to 10 years of life is you have to work harder as a parent, okay? And the vast majority of people don't want to prolong it for 20 years. So they don't want to have children, super spaced out because then they will have to repeat the process again and again, and they are getting older. Not to mention, Singaporeans are having their children later, they're getting married later, they're having their children later, they are studying more, which delays everything, right? So it also means that their fertility windows are compressed as well. And I think even this notion of wanting to have children in fairly quick succession, not need to be super fast, but fairly quick succession, has been there for a very long time, because probably even parents in the past, and the whole point of, playmates, and you want the age gap to be not so significant. So there are many reasons why parents do that. And then often if you, when I interview families with grown-up children, right, the third child, the fourth child, like accidents, it's not planned in the same way.
Right. The sequential child is also based on whether or not the first one is well-behaved.
I wouldn't say it's so much just well-behaved. I think different children have different needs. And I think parents today are also more aware of the various needs children might have. They're more kind of plugged into, they are watching videos from psychologists on social media. They're kind of in this ecosystem that is also trying to make them more engaged parents and kind of celebrate a certain type of parenting. Not to mention, parenting is a lot more of a shared activity today than it used to be in the past. So what I mean by that is that the division of labor was very gendered, and different people, in the past, the father might have looked after the income earning and the mother oversaw the entire domain of kind of child rearing almost independently. So that's very different because the mother was not also working, having a full-time job, etc. So that has changed. And that also means that like how you think about managing the child that you have involves a lot of negotiation between parents, right? It involves kind of like a shared commitment to making decisions. When both parents are heavily involved, then both will want to have a say in deciding X and Y, and they are both managing the home and their work. It's like more moving plates going on for, each couple who are having these children, because it's not like, one person's just taking care of it and then they make a decision about whether to have another child. It's both of them are weighing in, can we manage another child? What is it going to be like if we have another child? How do we resource ourselves with the additional help we need? There's far more negotiation involved in a marriage these days to raise a child than was needed in the past. And so then, both people have to be on the same page, so have whether they have the bandwidth to have another child. This is not to say, we know the data shows that mothers still shoulder disproportionate, they disproportionately are responsible for caregiving. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still more of a negotiated decision. And it might mean that the mother is thinking, well, I know what kind of contribution or involvement my partner can do. Do I have the bandwidth to keep working full-time and have another child? And obviously that bandwidth will be decided on the basis of the needs of the existing child, right? I have spoken to so many families like, oh, my child just cries so much. They don't sleep well. These are very common childhood occurrences across the population that parents are like, well, I can't consider having another child right now because I'm so sleep deprived. Child has to start sleeping independently through the night, and then maybe we can think about it. So that's an example of very run-of-the-mill sequential decision-making when it comes to having kids. Yeah.
So for a dual income household, now, is there a difference for couples juggling careers? Like, you've mentioned all these considerations that the couples will have, whether to have 2 or 3 kids. Do working parents hesitate getting outside help from parents or from domestic workers? Is that a very strong consideration? And is that consideration coming because there's a fear of having failed as parents? Do parents always feel that they need to be there all the time?
Our notion of what it means to be a good parent has changed over time. And interestingly, what we see from global data is that, so fathers, for example, have become way more involved than they were in the past. But interestingly, mothers are spending more time with their kids than they were in the past. You would think that if fathers increase the amount of time, then mothers can reduce the amount of time, right? But that's not what's borne out in the data. So it's this kind of, there is just more intensive parenting norms where the expectations on both parents have increased.
This is for Singapore or for worldwide?
I don't have Singapore-specific data,
Right.
but this data has just been replicated in many, many places in the world. And it is because we do see a lot more involvement from fathers in Singapore, but we don't see mothers kind of saying that they have recovered more time for themselves, anything like that. So I would be surprised if we do not also follow the same trend. Yes, there is this need, there is this feeling that I must be a present parent, I must be an involved parent. There is a tricky balance here because on the one hand, of course, that kind of having a better relationship with your parent involves them being present for you. And a lot of adults now feel sad or bad that they didn't get that from their own parents, right? And that also motivates them wanting to do it for their children. It can be one of the factors that builds a beautiful relationship between parent and child. But there's also a tipping point at which it is too much and can affect the child negatively, can affect the parent negatively as well, because, we have the concept of helicopter parenting and how that affects a child's development, and you need to allow your child, a certain level of independence from quite a young age for them to build up their own resilience and all of that. So that kind of ability to also stand back and have that distance between parent and child also has an important role to play in parenting. I think everybody's trying to figure it out for themselves as to where the right line is. But I think it is definitely the case that parents are a lot more involved. And it's not just about, culture and what they see on social media and being influenced and stuff like that. It's also the society we live in. So there are a whole bunch of structural factors that have meant that parents have no choice about being super involved or being the kind of the buck stops with me. There are not that many other people involved in my child's life that, can kind of contribute to this. It takes a village to raise a child type of mentality, right? So you also have to see it from just the reality that parents exist within. It's not like they live in a place where children are running from neighbor's house to neighbor's house. Most parents don't really even know their neighbors. People are also growing up around fewer kids. So with a falling fertility rate, it means that every child today is surrounded by fewer kids than in the past, right? And which also normalizes certain things. I mean, just this morning, my daughter is on school holidays and she was like, I have nobody to play with. Why do you have to go? And it's that sort of how did the parent become the playmate, right? But I look around and I'm like, who else is going to be her playmate? There are, of course, and, but they're not easily accessible. The parents then have to organize the play dates and then you have to...
It's a whole activity in itself in organizing it, right? Yeah.
Exactly. It's a whole thing in itself. And so you don't have that kind of, whether in the past it was created by, there were more siblings, more cousins, more kids in the neighborhood that you kind of, I still remember the kids I played with when I was young. I remember their names. I remember
going over to the neighbor's house and say, hi, do you want to play?
Yes, yeah. In a way that I don't necessarily remember so well all my school friends who are kind of further away in terms of circles and things like that. But these memories are very clear because they were so accessible, so reliable, just because they're there and you're in such proximity to each other. So just the fact that, there are fewer children around, our kind of living arrangement is very atomized. You don't know who your neighbors are, you don't know them very well. Your children are not going to be hanging out with them. You're quite unlikely to even borrow sugar from them, right? So it's a kind of existence where I think the pressure on parents is quite high.
Because they're mostly alone doing it. And they
Yes.
feel like the responsibility is solely on themselves.
Correct.
And I guess also when you talk about all this neighborhood, it's also the kampong spirit that it's not that strong these days. Because you've also mentioned about the Austrian example before this recording. That there were people who have this whole compound and children just go around and being looked after by other people for a short while.
The Austrian example came from a demographer. His name is Wolfgang Lutz. He's a grandfather now. He told me a story of how he raised his children, and there were 16 families that got together and bought a plot of land.
Where was in the 1980s or 90s?
Yeah, I think it was in the 80s and 90s. And they this plot of land at the back connected all these houses, and they could run in between the houses. And, among 16 families, there will be a couple of adults who are around, right, to keep an eye on things. But they are adults that the other parents trust, right? We can afford to do better and kind of connect with each other better. There's a reason kind of why we've ended up in this situation due to multiple factors. And it's very difficult, I think, for parents to form these communities in the places that they live. So we now live, and so this kind of goes into kind of social capital research. We live in times where people tend to connect strongly with people that they have common interests with rather than common geography with. This kind of, I guess, goes back to a similar theme that I talked about earlier, which is actually using the momentum that already exists. So if people are not very close to the people that they happen to live nearby to, how can we actually build spaces that incentivize people who are already close to move in together with? So can we imagine, say, BTOing, I don't know, like 12 families who already have connection with each other, all get together? Do we want to give them the ability to be prioritized and create that space? So if everybody's incentivized to actually...
And they're not really related by blood?
No.
Okay.
Because it's very hard to manufacture the connection with the neighbors that you kind of feel, fairly disconnected from anyway. Whereas everyone's got people in their lives that they want to connect with. Can we actually, as a society, build on that to create environments that are actually a little bit more communal, right? Because it's not that it doesn't exist at all. It's not that Singaporeans don't like connecting or that we're not friendly. It's just that society's changed. We have, had the HDB experiment change the way we live with each other. So now we have to kind of think of new ways of creating that kampong without necessarily just kind of wagging our finger at people and saying, you got to do better.
Speaking of new ways, there was one experiment you suggested as well in another commentary about parents getting either $300,000 or $500,000 of endowment per child. All parents received CPF-based caregiving credits. Could you maybe elaborate? Where do you get that idea from?
So that idea comes from thinking about whether or not, firstly, we need to actually renew our idea of what the contribution is of a person having a child or a family having another child, right? So in the past, it's always been seen as a private decision. It's not thought of as a contribution to society. Even if it has been, it's just never been really talked about in that way. People don't kind of think about, well, by having children, this family has made a huge contribution to society. But we live in different times now. We are in this position because, fertility has fallen so fast and so far that we are now kind of forced to reconcile with the idea that actually, what is society or livelihood, just life going to look like without so many people or without the number of people, without...
To form the Singaporean core, right?
I mean, that's how the government talks about it, but it's kind of, it is this notion of kind of cultural continuity, right? I don't particularly care whether the person is Singaporean or not Singaporean, but if they can integrate, then they're part of
our society, right?
Our society, right? But the numbers, we're getting to a point where the numbers are quite stark in terms of what that's going to look like in the near future. So I was listening to this demographer, who's also an economist. He is at Penn, and his name is Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, and he made this point about Japan. So he said, Japan is currently 98% ethnically Japanese, and if they kept population numbers constant via immigration, in 200 years' time, Japan will be 5% ethnically Japanese.
That's quick.
Right? So Japan is an interesting case because it is ethnically quite homogenous. And so the culture, a lot of it's tied up with the ethnic culture, the language, and it made me think. So I was reading about this and thinking to myself, okay, maybe we're in not such a bad position because we're already a multi-ethnic society. So, what does it mean to have, if you want to talk about it in terms of this kind of core part of society, in terms of cultural continuity of what it means to have a Singapore. But the numbers are not good because our TFR is 0.87. So at current fertility, the citizen-born population reproduces at about 41% of replacement every generation, right? And if we hold total population stable through immigration, which is the realistic policy response, even if you don't want to try and increase population numbers just to hold it steady, right? Singapore's citizen share drops from about 60% today to below 50% in 2045 or around 2045 and roughly 5% by 2130.
Which actually makes sense as compared to Japan, because Japan's TFR, as I'm researching now, it's at 1.14 and ours is even lower at 0.87. So we would actually shrink faster than Japan.
We already are a multi-ethnic society. So it's not about wanting to, everyone to have more people that look very similar to them. But culturally, at 5%, Singapore will be very, very different to what it is today. So that's kind of like the kind of cultural continuity argument. You might say there's also an economic argument because when people have children, those children eventually grow up and they become contributors to society. They earn money, but they do far more than that. People often focus on the earning money and paying taxes, but they look after one another, they care for one another, they ensure that people don't die alone. They do a whole bunch of nurturing and caring for one another. And all of that has an inordinate amount of value, right, that we often don't calculate. So then when you start to think about how much human beings contribute, should we not, as a society, think about the contribution and honor the contribution that is being made by people who are willing to have children, especially in an environment where that choice is increasingly not the path that many people are taking. So that's where the kind of background thinking about the experiment that I proposed comes from. This notion that, okay, are these people who have children, are they actually doing something that's extremely highly valuable for society? And the fact that, our governments around the world are all feeling pressed by TFR dropping would suggest, yes, it's a very important contribution that people make. So then we come to what does a kind of endowment or a reward or an incentive or some kind of acknowledgement look like in a society where there's high educational attainment, where there is very high labor force participation for women, and where we are a wealthy country. Things are expensive, but people also are relatively wealthy compared to many parts of the world. And when you start thinking in those terms, this is not about the $10,000 baby bonus, because it's no longer about the cost. It's about the opportunity cost of parenting, right? So when people say, oh, it's too expensive, this is what I was talking about in terms of how we understand what the data means and how we kind of put together numbers and what you hear on the ground. The vast majority of people are not struggling to put bread and eggs on the table, right? They are thinking about what this means for them long term. Does this mean that, often as the female who is going to end up with a higher caregiving burden, what does this mean for the years I take out of the workforce, on the missed career opportunities? I also studied very hard and worked myself off to kind of attain this position that I have, or this ability to contribute to society in a way that I like, or I really want to keep doing this thing that I'm doing that I worked hard to do. Why should I give it up? Or should I give it up? What does it mean for me? Like, is that something I really want to do? And how can I kind of think about the opportunity costs of it? And people in that position are no doubt having those thoughts. Those thoughts exist for people making the decision to be parents in the first place. They also exist for parents thinking about having another child, right? Because it's not motivated by this kind of selfish me. Like, it's a genuine sort of like, if I give up or I take a 6-year career break, what does this mean for my own contribution? What does this mean for my family, right? Because we live in a society where most people feel like they need the double income to plan for their housing, their children's needs, their children's very long educational needs now. So all of these things kind of factor into the decision making.
Is there a consideration when, say, for instance, if a family wants to go from 2 to 3 in terms of the dual income, is there consideration into going to a single income? Is that a conversation that you always have when you conduct research with people?
It's because often, like, if it's a family with 3 kids, it is often a single income family. Or they have helpers. Sometimes they have multiple helpers. Because, so to answer your question kind of very simply, more children means more, like, in an intensive attention environment, they need to have more hands, right? And if your children are also fairly close in age, they are not yet in this thing where, the oldest child can also be chipping in. Often families, once they move to the 4th child, then often the oldest child does also become like a,
semi-caregiver.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's a kind of, or at least just a slightly more responsible child who can keep an eye on, because there's a lot of chaos, right? Kids are chaotic. Until a certain age, you need to have some eyes on them. And at certain ages, they need a lot of one-on-one care. Right. So the research on parental leave is instructive here, because the research on child development says that the first 18 to 24 months are very crucial and involve actually, like, the child actually needs to have kind of very dedicated caregivers who can respond to their needs, play with them, talk to them. They're not really ready to play with other children. They might engage in parallel play, but they don't actually engage with the other child. It's kind of like they play together in the same environment, but they don't play with each other. Right? So some countries that had some success earlier on in the 2000s and the 2010s, actually their parental leave policies are designed to allow both parents to effectively cover this period in a child's life. So, for example, you might say, okay, the mother gets 9 months, the father gets 9 months, and then if they both take it in full, they can get another extra 6 months. So that period in a child's life is covered. And what's interesting about this is that it fundamentally changes the caregiving burden, because I have spoken to people, who have gone through these systems, maybe in Sweden. And what happens for the father is that it's quite nerve-wracking to be alone with your baby initially. But by the end of a 9-month period, they're completely comfortable with solely looking after. So what happens with caregiving is that any children, existing children or future children, the caregiving burden can be more equitably shared, because it's not like one person is the project owner and the other person you can delegate tasks to, like each parent has had that training ground to have that time. So you have this sort of like the children, they have these different kind of stages in child development where they need you intensively, then they need you slightly less intensively, and then really they need more independence. So when you ask me why families with 3 children often have to go to a single income, it's because it's just not, it defeats the purpose of having the child, because the parents want to be able to spend time with their children. And it's very difficult to come home after work and just so your child is in infant care the whole day, and then you just come home and you have to divide your time between 3 children.
Sounds very tiring already.
It's tiring, yes, and that I think really, people feel that deeply. But I think parents also, they often end up kind of thinking, well, one of us has to stay at home, because they're like, well, what are we doing this for? We had these children because we wanted to create this family and spend time with them and whatnot, but everything's too stretched. And Singaporeans tend to feel that way anyway about their work. They kind of... So, yeah, I think it's very difficult to really kind of countenance the idea of having 3 children and having a dual income family in our culture, in our work culture, really.
So how friendly is the workplace in Singapore, in your opinion?
I think that in Singapore, we have made some strides in terms of policy, right? I think the government sees that things need to change, but we're still culturally not there yet. And we can see this as evidenced by things like the take-up of paternity leave, men saying that they feel like they will be penalized for taking leave, and, parents talking about the parenthood penalty that exists if they take time off the workforce. We have made many small tweaks to parental leave, and people might say that that's unfair of me to say they are small tweaks, because we seem to be kind of adding to it quite often in recent years, right? And I am very supportive of that and very grateful for that for all the families that I talk to. But compared to the type of public policies in this space that exists in the world, I still think that we still have a lot of work to do, right? We're still quite a distance away from even equal parental leave for fathers and mothers. So we can keep chugging along there. But we tend to also have this fairly slow approach, or like incremental approach, I suppose, where we want to try and be very consultative between employers, and we want to bring everyone along. And that's very admirable. In fact, that's how a lot of good public policy should be done. But it also means that the changes cannot be radical. And the thing about fertility and fertility rates is that change is very, very slow moving in terms of actually seeing change, right? I have in the past compared it to like a tectonic plate shifting. So will we actually kind of see the changes that we want to see with these incremental changes to workplace policy? It makes it very hard. And it also makes it very hard for culture to shift, where people actually feel safe to take the allowances that they are granted, whether it's via about flexibility or, or leave. There is always a kind of chasm between what is allowed in theory and what is taken, or what is felt like is allowed in practice. Because people will calculate for themselves, like, this particular boss, how will they respond to me saying, I'm going to do this? How will that affect my career trajectory, etc.? So, we have that. We have still a ways to go. And interestingly, like we were talking about Sweden earlier, and one of the things that's interesting about Sweden is that it changed the way dads actually react to taking parental leave. So there was a time where if you didn't take your parental leave, nobody blinked an eye. But now if you don't take parental leave as a father, you are frowned upon. You're not a good father if you don't take your parental leave. So that's kind of like social sanctioning working in, cultural change happens. But we are far way off a society where everyone actually says you had a child. That's a really important thing. You need to go and fulfill your duties because, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, it's like this is a super important contribution that you are making, right? Potentially far more consequential than the contribution you're making through your work, right? But we don't yet think like that in Singapore. So yeah, there's still, I think culturally we still have a lot of work to do to become truly family-friendly workplace culture.
Personally, for you, I understand that you have 2 children.
That's right.
What was the decision like? I mean, how did you rationalize going from 1 to 2 children?
Well, so my partner and I both were very open to children. He comes from a large family. I come from a 2-child norm family. And it was always sort of like, the desire was always to have more than 1 child. But we always said, we'll see what happens. And I had my first child when I was 33, so not young. He wasn't an easy baby to have. And so for the first 2 to 3 years, it was like, it's just not on the table. The idea of having a second child was just, we weren't talking about it. I mean, maybe periodically revisit it, but it was kind of like, nah, we won't be able to manage this. And so it was only when we felt like things got a little easier and manageable that, it suddenly became like, oh, maybe we should have a second child. And we had, so there's a significant age gap. There's a nearly 5-year age gap between my kids, 4.5 years, yeah.
Wow.
So, it is.
Do you resonate with some of the concerns that the subjects that you've interviewed have?
Yes. I mean, because this is what I do for a living. I take what my research participants say very seriously, and I kind of try and see things from their perspective. My own personal decision making is, is similar in that, like, it's similar in the sense of it's a bandwidth issue. Like, I remember wanting to have 3 children, but very quickly after having my second child, I was like, no, I can't. It's not like if I try to push to have a 3rd child, then the trade-offs will probably not be good for me mentally and will obviously affect my family as well. So you kind of quickly reassess, like, sure, yeah, in an ideal world, it would have been nice to have more than 2 children. It didn't seem like feasible in my particular circumstances. And I very quickly made peace with that because you have the children you have, it's it is what it is. So in that sense, I see that a lot when I am talking to research participants as well, in that it is almost never, in fact, I don't think I've ever met anyone who's kind of like, I'm die going to have this many children no matter what. It's always kind of like,
we'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes.
Right.
We will reassess. And the intent might be there, but it's still very much based on what's happening. And people have all kinds of different pressures. You might have like sandwich generation pressures, right? Because you have children later, your parents are older, more likely to have their own health issues. And that's a whole thing. Relatedly, grandparents are also very different from what they used to be like in the past, in the sense that the current generation of grandparents, a lot of them that are themselves highly educated, have worked for most of their life, have got a pot of savings, they have their own dreams about what they want to do with their retirement, and it doesn't always involve looking after children all the time. So, that also contributes to like when
you need people to look after your children. The grandparents, they might not be a option for you, lah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you might not have, and then you think, okay, what are my options? Can I have a helper? Do we have enough space to have a helper? Do I want to have a helper in the sense that do I want to have a non-family member living with me? It changes the dynamics of how you are at home. And so, yeah, in that sense, I can see that my circumstances may not match up with all the people that I speak to for my research, but I can appreciate the kind of wide variety of factors that affect people's decision making. Like this problem in terms of raising fertility rates is really there's a structural thing. We can't just sort of talk to individual parents and try to urge them and convince them with money and like we have to try different things, but it's not one thing that is going to work. So going back to the experiment with the endowments, right? The whole idea is we should do an experiment. We should actually have different groups of random people, random couples in different pools and see if an endowment or CPF caregiving bonus or a larger endowment, do these things make a difference in terms of how people think about whether they want to have another child? We just don't have that kind of data.
What about relationship-wise then? In terms of, planning to find someone that you want to have children with?
I think we have bigger problems than that because right now there are some big things in a young person's life, a young Singaporean's life. And the big things are education, national service, and BTO. They're very tightly coupled to one another in terms of sequence, right? So in terms of thinking about a relationship, it has become common, I'd say very common, for young people to put off thinking about having a relationship. They want to tick off what they need to do first before they feel like ready to have a relationship. And so I'd say that's one of the bigger changes in how people relate to relationships. You have fewer teenage romances, you have fewer, it's more kind of like I need to focus on getting my, education locked up. I need to, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised by this because as a society we have, incrementally become more and more focused on educational achievement. And so this is what is reflected back at me, from research participants.
So that means that the higher educated they are, the fewer the number of children that they have. Is that
Well, it's kind of more like, so the data is generally speaking, the more highly educated, you have lower fertility, but it's got to do with timing. Because if you spend more time, then you're more likely to put it off because you're not going to do it concurrently whilst you are studying or building your career because it doesn't quite work. You don't live in a culture where they make it easy for you to do both at the same time. You can't kind of take longer to do something and have a baby at the same time. Do you know what I mean? Like we have a very, you have to do this in this period of time and after you do this is your next step.
And it's very intensive, whatever that we're going to do.
Yes.
Like education, you really got to score, so you really put in all your all and you don't want to focus on any other things.
University students now are doing 6 stack internships before they get a job. Like sometimes they look at me like I'm mad. They're like, are you mad? Like, why are you asking me if I want to be in a relationship? I have no time to be in a relationship. I have got so many other things I need to do so that I can get a job, so that I can, and it's all very lockstep, right? So one thing that I was kind of like, we hear this, we read this on Reddit and you hear people talking about it. But actually in a research study, again and again, people are counting backwards. They're calculating backwards from want to pop out a baby at 32, need to be, married by the time I'm 30. So I need to BTO by the time I'm 25, 26, which means I need to find the person that I'm going to have kids with by the time I'm 23 or 24. And how many people do you know who have actually met the person that they're going to have babies with at the age of 23? Right? And also, one of the things that I've been writing this paper and I've been thinking a little bit about the quality of the relationships we create or we enable if we have this very lockstep sequence. And the reason a single person has calculated backwards is because they want the house. It's very clear. They can articulate it. I will miss out on the BTO unless I do all of these things, right? So if the focus is the house and you need to get into a relationship by a certain age, and maybe you can make do with staying in the relationship, but maybe if that relationship's quality isn't quite right for child rearing, you may not want to have children. So it's not just about kind of like, we also have to think about our society and the structural kind of environment that we have created. And are we actually creating an environment that allows people to have the kind of relationships that will eventually lead to, positive fertility decisions? Because it's very difficult to it is very hard, I think, for a young person to kind of meet someone and even discuss the possibility of having children. So I have spoken to some young people who are in the process of getting their BTOs. And often when I ask them about children, they're like, oh, I'm not thinking about that at all, right? That's not on my mind. I don't really want to talk about it because I am so far from being ready to consider that, right? But in our environment, they have to consider marriage. It's their first house. There are all these other consequential decisions that they think are very important, but they're not quite yet ready for thinking about children. And we can ask ourselves, does this create the kind of environment where you prioritize the kind of relationship that people actually feel like safe and want to have children in? I think that we need to do more research in this area because we haven't really focused so much on what's happening upstream, as you say.
A lot of questions still remain, but there's a very insightful. Thank you very much, Kalpana.
You're welcome.
Well, that's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Lynda Hong. And once again, thanks, Kalpana, for coming on to the show today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
You can email us your thoughts on this issue. Also, if you'd like to read SC articles or opinion columns, these links can be found in our podcast show notes. This episode is edited by Teo Tong Kai. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.